We get called. Turn is another ace, and we want to continue to build the pot here. I don't think that he's going to fold if he has a flush draw, and even though he probably should fold with the flush draw, maybe he'll even decide that because another ace comes on the board here that he can call again with like 9s or 10s, or some 8s that he might flat with pre-flop. That's a little bit of a stretch, honestly, but I could still see him calling with a flush draw for sure. And most likely 9s, 10s, jacks, all those kind of hands as well. So we're just kind of hoping that he has the ability to keep calling us here. And I think the bet sizing is pretty good. I don't think it needs to be much larger than this. It could be a little smaller, honestly. But I do want to kind of make my range look more like I could have a flush draw and make this kind of bet. And I don't think I can bet really small on the turn and make it look like a believable flush draw. I think that my range really looks a lot stronger if I bet like 3,500 on the turn here. It looks more polarized towards the netted hands. So I like to make a little bit larger of a bet, and that also starts to build a pot and lets us shove on most rivers. Here we have the ace-7 suited again against the same opponent that we flatted last time, and this time we get it right. We decide to 3-bet, and he does come along, and this is one of those flop textures that we're going to be c-betting even though we're not very happy about. He could easily have a hand like king queen, king jack, quite a few kings in his range, but still, as far as range advantages go, I think I have a pretty obvious range advantage here because I'm more likely to have kings and queens. Ace king, I don't think he really has any of those hands, so I should be betting this flop just because of that reason. And also, we don't really have any way of winning the hand if we check it down. Our ace high is unlikely to be the best hand, and he will have a lot of pairs in his hand as well that he's going to have to just fold to a bet on this flop. So it's a pretty easy spot to bet. And I like to go a little under half pot on this specific example, but I'm going to be betting this flop with a pretty high frequency. And he did have pocket tens, so not much he can do there. This is a pretty fortunate spot for us. We open under the gun with the king 10 off, which I wouldn't always be doing, but with my stack size, I'm completely happy with opening a fairly wide range. King 10 suited is a very easy open from early position, but I don't want you guys thinking that king 10 offsuit is just a hand that's an auto open from under the gun, because it's not a great hand for opening necessarily. But at certain tables, sometimes it's better, especially if we know the blinds don't defend enough, they're overfolding from the blinds, and if we know that the rest of the opponents at the table aren't really calling bets too often either, it's a pretty good hand to just try to steal the blinds with. Also, it's good when you flop the nuts, though. So we do decide to bet here on the flop. I think that with this flop texture, there's going to be someone that has a hand like an ace for sure. Also, hands like king queen and king jack, those type of hands are generally going to be calling as well because of the fact that they have the feeling that they have the draw to the straight as well. So there's going to be a lot of combos of hands that can call our bet on this flop. So I don't think there's any real reason for making a really small bet. So here on the turn, I do make a small bet, or checking the flop, I mean. I think we should always be betting the flop, is what I meant to say. Here on the turn, we're going to bet again. I think that he's going to continue to call with his ace X fairly frequently, very frequently, I would think, actually. He's definitely calling with like ace tens and all of his random ace X that he might have flatted with pre-flop as well. And we can also firmly think that he could have hands like queen jack, ace queen, ace jack, those kind of two pair hands that he's definitely not folding to three barrels. So basically, now that we've gotten to the point where there's 21K in the pot and 9K left in his stack, we would think that he'd be calling pretty frequently just because he's gotten himself pretty pot committed at this point, but he does not call our all in. I could have just over-shoved the turn here, or maybe bet a little bit more on the flop and then just had an easy shove on the turn. I think that when we make this bet on the turn, and it looks pretty strong for us to take this certain line. So maybe I missed out on getting his entire stack here, but I have a feeling that he just had a kind of mediocre pair plus straight draw hand that he just couldn't quite call. But he did feel like he was getting the right odds to call all the way to the river. And so, yeah. Didn't get his stack, but we did win a nice pot along the way. 8 deuce, you're just going to not be too involved there. 10-9 suited, we're definitely opening from under the gun. Pretty standard. Here we have the backdoor flush draw, and also we have some backdoor straight potential, and also we have the range advantage on this flop for sure. Obviously, we're going to have a lot more ace-x in our range. The stronger ace-x for sure. Like we have the ace-queens, and we have the aces and queens and sevens. He doesn't really have aces and queens too often. You'd think he'd be 3-betting with those hands, so we definitely have the more nutted advantage as well. Easy c-bet. Unfortunately, well, fortunately, he folds. Here, we have a great spot for a squeeze. D. Langer is a good regular that's been around for forever, and he is going to be opening fairly wide in this spot. I know that he likes to open quite a bit of hands, so it seems like a great spot for a squeeze. We have a great hand to do it as well. We have the ace blocker and the 10, which blocks hands like 10s and obviously aces, and it's just a great spot to do it. There's already quite a bit in the pot, almost 7K, so we decide to make a fairly large squeeze raise here. I think that we definitely have to make it at least 4x the original raise, probably closer to pot size, which would be 7K. I could have made it like 7,200 and really made it tough for anybody to call, that's for sure. And we're not expecting to get called very often in this spot. I think that 6,600 is enough to get through here. But unfortunately, D. Langer might have been onto us and realized that this was a good squeeze spot for me as well, and just decided to come back over the top. I was a little worried about it, but I still think that it's a good spot to try to pick up the chips in the pot. Unfortunately, it didn't work this time, but I still think that in the long run, that's definitely a good spot to try to take. Here we get a little bit squirrely and open the 4-5 off. I'm going to be opening a lot of combos from the button with my stack, and just the fact that I have position. Here we get an interesting line from the big blind player. I just can't really see him betting this flop with an ace really ever. Just kind of bizarre and not something that I ever would expect. So I decided to raise here and try to see exactly what his hand is looking like. I'm just thinking that he's probably not going to have too strong of a hand here, and maybe he'll call a raise on the flop with an 8 or something. It's most likely I think he has an 8 actually. And so I think that by raising the flop and then betting the turn, we're going to just win the pot a lot of the time that way. Obviously, this isn't a wonderful hand to do it. It's kind of like one of those no equity bluffs where there's very difficult for us to pick up a good hand. But at the same time, the spot just kind of makes a lot of sense as far as his hand doesn't really seem like it's going to be too nutted. And so I just decide that it's a great spot to try to pick a pot. And it's going to be very difficult for him to call on the turn. Even with a flush draw, I don't think he's going to be able to call a big bet on the turn. And an 8 for sure. It's going to be very difficult for him. The size on the flop I can talk about a little bit. I think that by making a small raise here on the flop, it's kind of looks like I could easily have an ace. If I make a really big raise here, it's just going to really, I think, look a little too bizarre. Like, if he's a good hand reader, he's going to know that it's not making a lot of sense for me to make a big raise here on the flop. Obviously, just raising in general doesn't make a ton of sense. I would flat a lot of the times on this flop with my ace highs, but because there's a flush draw out there, I think that I could be raising quite a bit as well with my ace, with an ace in this spot. So That's what I'm trying to represent here. I think that with a small bet, we can definitely raise and make it a very believable situation where he's going to believe the story that I have an ace here. It's not like out of line too much. And then here on the turn, I think that betting a little over half pot is good. Very tough for him to call there on the turn, knowing that he's most likely going to have to be calling off his stack on the river. It just puts him in a really tough position. And just because of the fact that we read that it's highly unlikely that he has an ace in that spot, it's very, very difficult for him to call a 3 streets for sure. We defend here in the big blind, 2 min raise, and get nothing on the flop, so just let that one go. 8, 9 of clubs, standard open, get blasted out of the pot. This is a pretty rough hand here. So we open with aces, and it's a pretty good flop for our hand, so we're going to make a standard c-bet. I would bet around 30% on this particular flop. I think that obviously there's not a ton of draws out there. There are a lot of straight draws, and I could imagine that the person that's flatting, their range is more polarized toward there's like king queens and king jacks and a lot of hands that can continue on this flop. So I'm expecting that a lot of the time he's going to be calling a bet on the flop, and then we can make a big bet on the turn and try to get a lot of value for our hand. But he folds, and the big blind calls instead. And when the big blind calls, I'm thinking that he can be calling with jack, a 10, all the straight draws, ton of straight draws, the queen nines, the 8 nines, the king queens. There's quite a bit of potential straight draws out there. So that's probably the most likely hands that he could have. So for that reason, I make a larger bet here on the turn. I don't think he's going to be folding a jack very often because he could easily put me on a hand like king, queen, ace, king. Those kind of hands make a ton of sense for me to bet small on the flop and then barrel larger on the turn. And strangely enough, he does raise the turn here. And it's kind of hard to put him on a specific hand that he would flat the flop, but I guess he would flat the flop with all of his sets and his 2 pairs, just because it's kind of one of those flops where flatting makes a lot of sense with your 2 pairs. You don't really need to raise with the idea that I'm not going to have. I mean, I do have potentially quite a bit of draws, but still, you don't want to like blow me off my hand if I'm bluffing, and you want to give me the option to keep betting. Maybe check raise a turn with your 2 pairs. So 2 pair makes some sense. I guess he could have hands like jack deuce suited, jack 10 suited, maybe even 10 deuce suited, and possibly jack 4 suited, but super unlikely. Jack seems like he would have almost certainly raised pre-flop, so it's kind of unlikely that he has jacks, but it's possible. So jacks, 10s, deuces, jack 10, and those are the most likely. So I need 21% to make for this to be the right call on the turn. I think that we do have 21% equity against. Also, if we include that he's going to do this with some of his straight draws to try to represent a really strong hand, and obviously still have some outs to make the nuts or to make a really strong hand. If I do call on the turn, I could definitely see him doing this with a straight draw. So I think that it's pretty standard call on the turn. Against some players that are really tight, it's maybe an easy fold on the turn because they're just not going to be doing it with enough draws and enough combinations of hands that it's really even going to be a profitable call. But if you know that your opponent is capable of doing this with draws and maybe even like overvaluing some jacks on the turn, like a king jack type hand, then it's a pretty easy call. Here on the river, actually, it seems like a great card for a hand, right? Because now at this point, we do beat almost all of his 2 pairs. All of his 10 deuce and jack deuce were counterfeited, and all of his draws didn't get there. That's for sure. So basically, we lose to jack 4, deuces full of 4s, 10s full of 4s, and jacks full of 4s. And it doesn't really seem like jacks full of 4s is that likely, but seeing as there's not a lot of combos that make a lot of sense for him to have at this point. And there are still some combos that he could be bluffing with his straight.